Hey everyone, I'm Morgan Beth and thank you so much for checking out this video. So I just wanted to take a quick minute to say that I have been delaying this video for so long. Okay, first of all, I bought this sewing pattern back in 2017 after I had tried on this dress here. It was from the costume shop I was working at. They had bought it off of someone else, but then added the boning and bedazzlement, blah, 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 blah. I got to try it on. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with this dress. So when I found the pattern on sale for literally $1 or $2, I knew I had to get it. But then there was the problem of finding the time to make it and trying to get all the fabric. And then 2020 hit. The good old pandemic where I suddenly had all of this time to make the dress and I somehow got all the fabric. And so I thought, let me use this project as like a first video to start a YouTube channel and just start sewing more and making things. And here we are in 2021, where I am hopefully now finally posting this video. So here we are. It's kind of a detailed walkthrough. I will say I do change the pattern actually a little bit. Instead of connecting the bodice to the skirt, I made it a two-piece set, and instead of using a zipper, I made a lattice back and everything. And I actually made this dress before I started using metal grommets or metal eyelets. I'm sorry, I don't know the difference. I think there might be one. So if you tune into some later videos that I'm hoping to post, because yes, I do have lots of more footage of me sewing different projects that I'm hoping to get around to edit together and post here. What was I saying? Anyway, if you tune into later videos, you may see that I change how I do lattice backs. And I have turned this into 2 parts. So this here is just for the Cinderella Bodice. So if you want to tune in to see how I made the skirt, check that out in my other video when I have that put together and made, because I don't think I even have the voiceover done for it yet. When I have the skirt video made, I'll post it here to this YouTube channel. Check it out there. And in the meantime, enjoy this one.
Alright, so starting the bodice for Cinderella, I'm gonna go ahead and cut out the fabric that I need for my pattern. And now here you're gonna see me cut out a piece for the skirt as well. This video is gonna be just of the bodice. I'm actually kind of following the directions for how to cut out your pattern pieces. But again, not completely, because here I go adding all these extra pieces just to maximize all of my fabric and make sure that I'm not wasting it. So go ahead and cut out all of your pieces. And as you can see, I have 2 of everything here except for the center front. And of course that one went on a center fold, so that unfolded, it's twice as wide as you need it to be. And I'm going ahead and just serging all of the edges of my fabric to make sure that they have finished edges so that they don't fray, and it just kind of helps the costume be a little sturdier and stronger for usage over time. Next, I'm going to apply interfacing to my outer fabric pieces. So I'm not going to apply interfacing to the lining. I'm just tracing off pieces for my outer fabric, and I will go ahead and iron that on. So as I'm ironing it on, please excuse the fact that I am using an old towel. I do now have an ironing board, but at the time I was making this video, I didn't, so just roll with me here, please. So let's start assembling the corset. I am going to start here with pieces 1 and 2, and we are going to attach them together, sewing right sides together. And now as you match it up, it's going to be important that you get this to follow the bottom curve. You'll see what I'm talking about once you have the pieces in your hand, but just play with it and make sure that the fabric of number 2 isn't going past the bottom fabric of number 1. So go ahead and pin those up. And before you run it through the machine, make sure that you've noted these dots, because you're not going to sew along the whole perimeter of the fabric pieces themselves. You're going to only sew from one dot to another. And it should look something like this. It looks a little weird now, but we'll iron it out later and make sure it lays nice and flat. Moving on, I now have pieces 4 and 5. And we are going to want to make sure that the angle of these pieces are going down. It's going to be important to the shape of the fabric, and I know it can get confusing when you have multiple pieces that look the same but are just on opposite sides. So run that through the machine, and it'll look like this. So later on you'll see I don't add the zipper to the center. That's what the pattern has you do, but I'm actually going to do a lattice back, so feel free to fast forward through that part later. But here's 4 and 5s together. And now we are going to add pieces 6 and 3. So we're actually going to take piece number 6 and add it to number 5, and then piece number 3 and add that to number 6. And this is also going to be important for lining up, because the 6 and 3 you sew together should create this little under arc that is actually going to be basically your armpit, and you want to make sure you have the right shape, or else your arm is not going to feel super comfy in the bodice. So I've pinned it together, and now I'm just gonna sew it all up. And when you're done with that, it should look like this. So now you have 2 back sides of your corset, and all that's left to do now for this layer of bodice is sew it to the front piece, pieces 1 and 2. And again, make sure you're lining the pieces up so that the angles all go together. You want to make sure that pieces 4 are on the outsides, and that you're only sewing number 2s and 3s together. And here is the outer fabric of our bodice. Go ahead and serge all of the lining and sew all of them together like we just did. Next, I'm going to add some boning to my bodice, and this isn't going to be too tricky. We're going to take all of the seams we made and just close them off and insert the boning into each of the tubes there, every single one of them. And I'm going ahead and measuring how long my boning needs to be, but I'm also making sure that I don't add the boning to the top. I'm going to go about 2.5 inches down to make sure I have enough room for seam allowance, and making sure I have enough room for flipping it, and I'm going to go ahead and cut those out. Now for my boning, I'm going to have to iron it out flat because it came in a spiral. If you're using a different boning, or maybe a higher quality boning, you won't need to do this, but I just want to make sure my boning isn't curved, or else the bodice will not lay correctly, and I want to make sure that the boning is supporting my bodice and not adding a curved shape to it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off my edges of the boning by cutting a circular rounded edge to it. I'm going to do it to both sides and to every single piece of boning. And I'm also going to use band-aids to help round off and finish the edges so that they don't poke or cut through the fabric after it's made. Now, of course, you don't have to use band-aids. It's just what I happen to have on hand. You can also easily use duct tape, or you can also buy caps for your boning depending on what kind of material your boning is made out of. I'm going to cut the band-aids into little strips, and I'm going to add it to each piece of the boning. And it's going to look like this. Kind of weird, but hey, as long as it doesn't rip through my fabric, I'm good. So all of your boning should be done and ready to be inserted into the corset. So I'm ready to sew my boning in, and I'm again just making sure that I keep the 2.5 inch distance from the edge that I want. And I'm going to mark that off on the piece itself so I know where to sew the seam closed. So I'm just going to close off the seam, insert the boning, and then close it off again. And here is our lining, and each boning is going to have to lay a different direction. Feel free to check out the instructions packet to make sure you have them going the same. I'm going to go ahead and now add piping to my bodice outer layer of fabric, and this is my top of the fabric. and this is the bottom. So I'm just having it in this direction so it's easier to pin on. Don't worry if it looks a little confusing. And if you haven't worked with piping before, you actually want to put it upside down so that the cord is not along the bottom edge. We want our extra fabric here that we will sew on to be against the bottom edge of our bodice. And I'm taking a measuring tape here to make sure that my piping is 1 inch away from the bottom. And this is optional. I'm just doing this to make sure that my piping is even across the entire bottom edge, that it's not swerving or curving or anything. Just something I like to do to keep track of my pinning. So now that you've added a million pins into it, it should look something like this. And I really took my time pinning on the curve just to make sure that it looked like how I want to. And you may notice I have a few extra pins around here. This is just to make sure that these seams that the boning are in are laying in the proper direction. Refer to the instructions packet to figure out which way each seam should be facing. I did it there for each piece on number 2. And for this piece here as well, which should be piece number 6. I've also gone ahead and switched out my foot here so that it is a zipper foot so that I can sew the piping in. And just be sure you're really careful with your fingers on here because you do not want to get your finger anywhere near that needle. It will not be fun, trust me. And here it is attached to my outer layer. And now the next step is going to be adding the outer layer to the lining. Now we want to make sure we have good sides together. And we're going to go ahead and pin all the way around the bottom here. Pieces 1 and 2. Pieces 5 and 4. We're leaving the arm area open so that we can add the sleeves, and you'll see why a little later. Now that it's all sewn together, I'm going to go ahead and flip it so that right sides are out. My bottom front curve came out a little interesting. I could go back and fix it, but I'm okay with how it happened. Again, the arms are open here so we can add sleeves later. And looking at the side here is where you would add the zipper. But I'm actually going to go ahead and make myself a little lace-up detail to add to the back. I'm just going to take these extra pieces of fabric and turn them into little laces to add to the center back feature. So here we are, my bodice is now closed at the center back on each side. Just added a few laces. It honestly wasn't that tricky. A zipper, of course, would be easier, and following the instructions of the packet, but I just wanted to have this for adjustability, and hey, it looks pretty. Let's go ahead and move on to the sleeves. So I have 4 sleeves cut out. I am using the same fabric for the outer and the lining, but my outer has interfacing applied to it. I'm going to go ahead and move the paper back of the interfacing, and I'm going to go ahead and line it up so that right sides are together. And we're actually going to be making a French seam, but just start by sewing the bottom edge of the sleeve together. Now that I have my seam on the bottom of the sleeve here, I'm going to go ahead and open it and look at the inner seam. I'm going to use my parchment paper because I am going to iron on top of my interfacing, and I don't want to accidentally glue the fabric to itself, but I just want to open that seam so that it lays flat, like this. And now I'm gonna go ahead and with my right side facing up on the machine, I'm gonna sew along here to finish off making my French seam. And this is just making it so that the seam allowance on the inside lays flat. And next I'm going to fold wrong sides together and iron out that seam so that it lays flat. And again, I'm just using parchment paper because I'm ironing over my inner facing and I don't want to accidentally glue the lining to the outer fabric. Now that the French seam is done, I'm going to fold right sides together so that I am working on the inside here. And I'm gonna go ahead and take the elastic and sew it onto the top edge of the sleeve here. You're going to want to make sure the elastic is pulled so that you have it stretched out and creating the ruffled effect on the top of the sleeve. I'm now going to make another seam right below the elastic so that it's just a clean edge to my sleeve and that there's no chance of the elastic showing through when I flip the sleeve right side out. Now I am folding right sides together and I'm just going to close off the sleeve with a little stitch here. And that is the sleeve for our bodice. And so that the seam lays flat, I'm going to go ahead and just stitch down each side of that as well. Now when it comes to attaching the sleeves to the bodice, you're going to want to make sure you're working with the serged edges of the sleeves and the serged edges of the bodice as well. With right sides together, pin the curve of the sleeve to the curve of the armhole on the bodice and sew the sleeve onto the outer fabric only. So you see I only have it pinned to the outer fabric and I'm leaving the lining free as I sew it through the machine. To finish off the corset, I'm going to go ahead and fold down the lining so that the raw edge isn't seen and sew that by hand so that the whole bodice is now closed. And when you're done, it should look something like this. So you have nice clean edges on the outside and a clean edge on the inside as well. Now let's go on to making the drape across the front of the bodice. Starting off, I'm going to do just a single stitch across each side. Widest stitch you can make because you're going to gather it later. No backing to lock in the stitches. And then go ahead and do a double stitch on the curve here. One to stitch it together and the second to gather. So go ahead and gather the side. Go ahead and gather the top and then gather the closing side as well. And for this, I just laid it and tacked it on however I liked. I adjusted the poof, I adjusted so that it was mirror image roughly on each side. And that is the Cinderella bodice.